Blood of Dragons, Volume 8, Dawn's Purpose. Chapter 1, Dawn's Guardian. Not one for wasting time and effort, Isran took the spiralling staircase 2 steps at a time, striding his way up without the slightest hindrance. The interior of the fortress echoed his steps back upon him, as the clapping of leather boots on ancient stones, but he didn't care. Something as simple as the sound of his footsteps was so far down his list of things to be concerned about that it was almost on a separate list entirely. Vampires were making their presence felt throughout Skyrim, dragons were returning and burning entire villages, and both the Imperials and the Stormcloaks were at each other's throats, determined to outperform the other in number of lives lost. In amongst it all, he was trying, almost desperately so, to re-establish an ancient order of vampire hunters that Skyrim hadn't seen the like of in the better part of a millennium. Even with the increasing numbers of towns and villages that had suffered outright attacks by vampires and their minions, the numbers of volunteers arriving at the fort were limited both in number and skill. My pa's axe, he thought bitterly to himself and shook his head. The couple of new arrivals that morning had potential, but whether the vampires were going to be gracious enough to give him the time to make something of them was yet to be seen. If such emotions weren't a foreign concept to him, he would have been deciding whether to laugh or to cry. His frustration burned its way into his limbs, and he soon began sprinting his way up the stairs, taking them 3 or even 4 at a time. It was a considerable climb up the narrow staircases to the upper levels, but the past years he had lived within the fortress ensured that when he arrived on the 6th floor, he was barely breathing heavily at all. What had long ago been known as Fort Dawnguard had been built to last, even when it was nothing more than a tidy border outpost overlooking the southern pass between Skyrim and Morrowind. During its prime, it would have been able to hold off an Imperial legion and comfortably house several hundred soldiers and supporting staff. Those days, however, were long in the past. Like skulking mice, the few dozen members of the renewed Dawn Guard lived a meagre existence, and despite living in the fort for over 3 years, Isran had barely made any identifiable changes to the fortress's centuries-long abandonment. Although the sheer scale of the enormous castle gave him and the slowly growing numbers of future vampire hunters space for anything, and everything they could think of. The central hall had been turned into an archery range, the primary mess hall had been combined into a kitchen and dining hall, and the ancient smithies were being cleared of dust ready for plating weapons of silver. Almost most importantly, it was also large enough and spacious enough to give him some measure of peace, in the form of private quarters where the fort commander once resided. Muttering to himself, he pushed his way through the door into his room, but tensed within seconds as his finely tuned instincts alerted him to a presence before he saw or heard them. There was little within the bounds of Nirn or even oblivion that could hope to catch him unawares, not that the person within his room had been intent on ambushing him. Sitting on one of the hard wooden chairs, leaning back with his legs outstretched and feet crossed at the ankles, the armoured figure looked upwards from the book he was reading and gave Isran a friendly smile. "Good afternoon." The habitual scowl on Isran's face deepened, and his lips turned into a thin pink slit framed in his wiry beard. "I don't believe I was expecting a visitor." "Sorry." A snap made itself heard as the man closed the book he was reading. "Jurak sent me up and said this was the best place to find you. With how big this place is, I wasn't going to go wandering around looking for you and thought it would be best to wait." "Who are you?" Closing the door behind himself, Isran glanced in annoyance at the man who was entered his personal quarters uninvited. "And what do you want?" "I'm Kaius." If he felt aggrieved by the bluntness or Isran's tone, or was feeling apologetic for intruding, Kaius didn't show it, instead turning his full attention to the vampire hunter standing a few meters in front of him and continuing to smile. "I heard that you were looking for vampire hunters, and I thought I'd come and offer some information and perhaps my services." Taking a moment and looking over Kaius, Isran grudgingly acknowledged that unlike most of the others who had come, he was experienced at least. A lot could be learned from a simple glance, and he liked what he saw. The armour Kaius wore was extremely well made, but had signs that he didn't just wear it for show. He carried no shield, and while he might have left it elsewhere, his battered vambraces attested to a skilled swordsman who blocked with sword and forearms. Even his scars he wore were like badges of honour, especially the aged white line under his right eye, and there was little doubt in his mind that Kaius was well used to hardship. From the rough cut of his hair and goatee to the pragmatic, effective repairs and maintenance on his clothing and equipment, they were all indications of someone who lived rough, travelled frequently, and didn't shy away from conflict. You heard right. A brief glance over his desk and throughout the room revealed that nothing had been moved, stolen, and besides the book Kaius had been reading, otherwise untouched. He didn't expect anyone to be foolish enough to steal from him, and then be waiting at the scene of the crime for his return, but trust was a word that Isran didn't know how to spell, let alone one that had existed in his vocabulary. I'm glad word's finally starting to get around, but that means it won't be long before the vampires start to take notice as well. I'd say that they have begun taking notice. Gently and carefully, Kaius placed the book he was reading under the top of Isran's desk and rose to his feet. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I'm here. I have what you call a bit of experience with vampires in Cyrodiil, but nearly 2 months ago my companions and I had a run-in with a nest of the vermin near Morthal. Just over a dozen of them, and twice as many thralls. This caught Isran's attention, and he gazed upon Kaius with growing interest. The stories of vampires in Morthal were spreading quickly through Skyrim, especially given the news of their destruction by some travelling adventurers. While it pleased Isran that a nest of the suckheads had been put down like the animals that they were, he was still slightly disappointed, because he hadn't had the pleasure of doing it himself. That caught your attention, eh? Kaius muttered, smiling out of the corner of his mouth. That's not even the best bit. Now, you can never be 100% certain of these things, but the vampire leading that particular group appeared to be none other than Movarth Pekin. You're certain? As best as I can be. He was certainly no typical vampire, that's for sure. A proper vampire ancient. Even if he wasn't the Movarth of legends, he was at least a few 100 years old and was no pushover. It took a bit of effort to put him down. Isran was struggling not to tap his fingers against his leg or pace back and forth in front of his new guest, especially how there was something that was eating into the back of his mind about the situation, or about Kaius. The news regarding Movarth, whether it was true or not, was interesting indeed. Most vampires barely lived beyond a couple of centuries, but unless killed through violence they were truly immortal. The older they were, the more powerful they became, and those 2, 3, or even 400 years old were the true stuff of nightmares. Movarth Pekin, if the vampire Kaius was talking about was indeed him, was one of the most ancient vampires that were known to exist within all of Tamriel. Easily 600 or 700 years old, and born sometime in the middle of the Second Era, he was also infamous, being one of the very few vampires to have been written about through several stories, most famously Immortal Blood, the semi-autobiography of Movarth's sire, whose own name had been lost to the centuries. Something tells me that there is more to your story. Yeah, pacing slightly in the room, eyes wandering over the various collections of items, pieces of equipment, and the sizable collection of books, scrolls, and other literature, Kaius flicked one of the many chains hanging from the ceiling in passing. Something weird is going on with the vampires in Skyrim. There's always a nest or two of them around, but this was different. I'm used to the likes of the Vampirum Order in Cyrodiil, keeping their heads down and staying hidden in the towns and cities. But Movarth's coven was actively working towards establishing something in Hjalmarch. They were enthralling some of the locals, and had started infiltrating the city. And not just a few thralls to feed on here and there either, but actively working towards weakening the guard, taking control over some of the burghers, and even one of the thanes. They were looking at taking over. and were well on their way to doing so before one of their newer members did something stupid. But you and your companions stopped them? As far as we can tell, Kaius shrugged. Going by a fraction of what I have seen from you and your group here, you will know as well as I that it's difficult to burn out any infestations completely. The thing that got me really curious and worried in equal measures is that there was a lot of evidence showing that this was not just a random coven with creams of grandeur, but something larger scale and organized. The increase in vampiric attacks over winter just adds to it. Kaius was right. There had been a massive increase of attacks by vampires throughout winter, and Isran had been gathering the reports and news that he could see over the past 2 years. Vampires in Skyrim were increasingly active. While that could be easily explained away by the opportunistic parasites taking advantage of the increased fighting between the Stormcloaks and Imperials during the long winter nights, Isran knew better. This was beyond simple raids and feedings by the odd handful. The targets, the attacks, and the damage was too clean, too precise, and too organized even between cities and holds, especially for typically ravenous, disorganized, and unaffiliated groups of bloodsuckers. Now, the odd one or two clans joining or working together, that's one thing. Moving away from the seat he had been reading one of Isran's books in, Kaius moved closer to the wall and the collection of books on the shelves, tilting his head slightly to read the covers. But there was way, way too much evidence in Mordvarf's lair showing that he was not only working with others of his kind, but was actually an underling. I don't think I need to tell you, of all people, what it means when a vampire from the Second Era is the literal lesser of two evils. While he was listening to Kaius as he spoke, Isran's sense of unease was building, and it was not as the result of the topic of conversation. Whether it was the spawn of Molag Bal or the children of Oblivion, there was nothing in this world or the next that was capable of increasing Isran's heart rate. His entire life and all the experiences in combat against Daedra and the undead ensured that even in the heat of battle his blood was cold. But here, in his own quarters, and staring at the man in full armour running his finger along the spines of his prized collection of books, his heart began beating 1 or 2 beats faster than normal. A treatise on prophoric haemophilia, sanguari vampiris, and the undead. Reading the title off the spine, Kaius drew the book from the shelf and briefly thumbed through the pages. Second edition as well. This is a really impressive collection. Eyes lifting from the pages, Kaius stopped in mid-motion, meeting Isran's gaze for a moment before glancing down to how the vampire hunter's hand was resting on the weapon at his hip. Ever since he had entered the room, Isran's instincts had been screaming at him, and now he knew why. For anyone else, it would have been impossible to notice, but a lifetime of experience let Isran know exactly what Kaius was. It was in the details, the way he moved, the way his feet pressed into the floor, and especially the way his hands and fingers grasped at items. There was a dexterity and smoothness to his muscles that no mortal could match, and an overwhelming strength that had to be constantly held at bay, lest it broke everything that he touched. "Look, I'm not here to fight," Kaius said simply, carefully and respectfully placing the book back onto its spot on the shelf. "I merely came here to pass on some information and retrieve something of mine." Chapter 2. Dawn's Hunter. In a movement born from decades of practice, Isran ripped the tiny hand crossbow from its leather holster at his hip and loosed the bolt directly into Kaius's chest. The silver-tipped bolt, dipped in an intense paralytic mixture of fungal pods from Morthal swamps and canis root, crossed the 3-meter gap between them in an eye blink. It should have been impossible to dodge, impossible for it to have missed, and yet any doubt that Isran may have had vanished as quickly as Kaius twisted out of the bolt's path. One of the few gifts he had from Serene Gerard before they had gone their separate ways was a marvel of technological engineering. Somehow she had merged an Akaviri repeating crossbow from the Second Era with a Dwemer arbalest, while also shrinking the design for portability and ease of use. The result was one of Isran's prized possessions, A tiny single-handed crossbow, the length of a dagger, capable of launching 4 custom-made bolts in quick succession. Its range was terrible. Its bolts lacked the power and impact of a larger design, but in close-range situations such as this, it was invaluable. The first 2 shots missed, one shattering on the stonework of the wall behind, and the second skittering off into the corner of the room with a wooden clatter as Kaius weaved away. He was supernaturally fast, dodging out of the way with the speed of the damned, but Isran had technique on his side. Almost instinctively, his arm twisted, finger twitching and pulling on the crossbow's release in quick succession, and technically not even aiming at Kaius when he released the 4th and final bolt. Many who hunted the things that lurked in the darkness made the mistake of trying to aim and hit the creatures as they moved. No mortal, no living being in existence was capable of meeting or catching them in such a way. The first 3 bolts were merely distractions, the means to force the creature to move where and how Isran wanted it to, and through instinct and experience the 4th slapped through the air between them. It flew true, the aim was perfect, loosing the bolt at just the right time to meet the creature's dodging movements to the side, but despite all the times he had successfully fought and killed the bloodsuckers, Isran had never encountered one fast enough to snatch a crossbow bolt out of the air. Seriously, the bolt snapped with the sound of a breaking femur between Kaius's fingers as he stopped and glared at the vampire hunter, dropping the pieces to the floor at the same time Isran dropped the empty crossbow. "I didn't come here to fight you. Then you came here to die." A bolt of pure, silvery light struck Kaius in the face, forcing him to stagger backwards, eyes running with tears and waving his hands as Isran called upon his magical reserves. Spells that had never seen the inside of the College of Winterhold or any mage's guild hall streaked through the air, overpowering the feeble light of the room's pair of lanterns. Each blast of light drove Kaius back as Isran conjured them into existence with flicks of his wrist, relentlessly slamming one after the other into the vampire's face. Engaging creatures, such as vampires, in open battle was one of the quickest and most painful ways to die. They had the strength of 10 men, could be as fast as a bolt of lightning, and were equally deadly whether they had retained their humanity or had fallen to darkness. Against such creatures, the only hope when faced with one was to go onto the offensive and remain on the offensive. They had to outwit and outthink the vampire, keep 2 or 3 steps ahead, and plan for every contingency, because as soon as the beasts gained the slightest advantage, it would be all over. It was this forethought and planning that allowed Isran to be ready when Kaius summoned a hazy, flickering ward between them that burst the burning balls of light like rotten fruits in midair. Normally, Kaius's control and ability of magicka would have been surprising, but not to Isran. Even though his vampiric opponent was clad in foil-lined steel plate armor, which was naturally hindering for most kinds of magicka, the spawn of Malog Baal were over crafty, but he was ready. Within a second of the ward being summoned into existence, a tiny clay pot was snatched from his belt and shattered against the ceiling between them. Little more than a palm-sized clay pot for storing alchemical ingredients, it was filled to bursting with carefully and finely carved slivers of silver coins that were little more than powder. The brittle container exploded and filled the air with dancing specks of light, almost too small to be seen with the naked eye. As expected, Kaius's ward failed almost the instant the tiny flakes reached him, and despite his best efforts, the coughing fit that claimed him made it difficult to do much else. The bursts of light in his face had been enough to feel like slaps, a sure sign to Isran that he was not some freshly turned vampire, but the silver powder was a different matter. Isran had first gained the idea from reading stories of how the Legion used quicklime in sieges, using the whitish powders to blind and burn the defenders no matter where they tried to hide, and silver was the bane of the undead and unholy alike. The fact that breathing in silver dust wasn't entirely healthy for mortals like himself didn't matter to Isran. He was expecting his eyes and throat to become scratchy and raw, whereas his foe wasn't expecting how the air comparatively turned into fire. Like it had against other vampires, the silver jar worked its deadly effects on Kaius, causing him to flail about against the onslaught, burning his skin and scouring throat, lungs, and eyes. Against a lesser creature, it would have been left whimpering and completely unable to defend itself, but Kaius was stronger, far stronger than most vampires. He shrugged off the pain as though it was an old friend, returning Isran's scowl with one that was less human than the one before. That tickles. The growl rose in his throat, and Isran somehow felt satisfaction as fangs split Caius's lips. He was losing control, and while the more animalistic the vampires became, the more dangerous they were also easier to goad, trick, and outmaneuver. Come on, monster, show me what you truly are. With a click, the leather straps holding his warhammer to his spine fell away, and the weapon fell neatly into his hands. It was 10 kilograms of steel with a heavy lead core, plated in silver and covered in runes of purity and banishment. Strong enough to batter its way through orichalcum plate armor and pulp its wearer's bones, it was also a relic of a long-dead knightly order from the Third Era. Through several centuries, the hammer had slain Daedra and monsters alike, and since finding itself in Isran's hands, it had added an impressive tally of undead to its illustrious history. Further showing his unnatural skills and abilities, Kaius twisted and writhed away from Isran as the hammer slammed into the floor with titanic force. The jar of silver dust was only meant to disorient and allow him to keep the initiative in the fight and wouldn't last long. Maybe 15 seconds at the most, but Isran was determined to make every single one of them count. Younger, more recently turned vampires had been put out of their misery in such a short space of time. But against an older, more powerful one like what Kaius was appearing to be, it was little more than a hindrance. Keeping the weapon close, using the silver-plated haft just as much as the enormous lead-cored head, he twirled and twisted it about, using its momentum and weight to keep Kaius unbalanced. The hammer ripped through the air with a deep-noted vroom with every movement, and Isran was grunting and snarling just as much as Kaius was. Unease threatened to dig its claws into his mind as he fought, but Isran forced it aside, even as even a moment of doubt could be enough to lose. Kaius was no ordinary vampire and had the resistances and abilities that matched any of the masters that Isran had ever fought. Even hindered by the powder, he was still faster than ordinary mortals, and the first blows struck nothing but air. But with a little technique and skill, Isran soon gained the advantage that he needed. Hooking the bottom of the warhammer's grip behind an armored knee, he swept one of Caius's legs out from under him, forcing the vampire to drop, even as he used the momentum to throw a vicious left hook. With Isran's full body weight behind the blow, it smashed Kaius to his knees, flesh and face burning and smoking from the silver-banded knuckle guards wrapped around Isran's fingers. Lips split apart, teeth were loosened, and a mouthful of blood and a fang spattered across the stone floor as Isran swung the hammer around and slammed it down as though he was chopping wood with an axe. From the impact that ran up through his arms, Isran would have sworn that he had struck the floor again, or tried to batter his way through a block of solid ebony. And despite all of the practice, his hands still went numb and tingling. Somehow, in the time between being punched in the mouth and the downwards hammer strike, Kaius once again showed his true speed, catching the descending warhammer with a loud slap that ripped through the air. In 30 years of hunting vampires, Isran had never encountered one that had attempted something as ridiculous as catching a weapon in mid-strike, let alone a full-strength blow from a silver, blessed warhammer. Such a surprise was costly, as even the tiniest fraction of hesitation was more than enough for Kaius to react. Surging to his feet, talons like polished ebony erupting from the tips of his fingers, and they sunk to the knuckles in Isran's armor as easily as it was cloth instead of steel brigadine. I did not come all this way to pick a fight with you. If I wanted you and the rest of your hunters dead, then you would already be cooling and rotting on the floor. Isran had slain numerous vampires through his life, but even he was stopped for a moment as he saw the way how Caius's face and flesh changed. Darkness, all-encompassing and soulless, filled Caius's eyes, his brow, cheekbones, and jaw cracking and pushing forward against the skin that kept them trapped. It was almost as though Kaius was becoming more daedra than vampire, as every tooth in his skull grew several centimeters in length and into pointed fangs in a jaw that had unhinged like that of a snake or great reptile. He could do nothing but watch with a sick kind of fascination as Kaius held him up off the floor with a single arm, seeing the way that the vampire crushed his monstrous nature into the depths of his soul where it had been lurking. Only the talons jutting from the bones of his fingers remained, still gripping and holding him aloft with a fistful of his ruined brigandine armor. For the moment, as he watched Kaius return to his more human appearance, Isran was uninjured. Somehow, and for some reason that he could not fathom, Kaius hadn't hurt him, even as he ruined the front of his armor with his claws. He should have been dead, and yet Kaius hadn't bothered to strike a killing blow by tearing out Isran's heart or throat. Isran, however, was not one to pull punches. Without conscious thought, a vial of holy water was smashed directly across Kaius's face, further injuring the flesh and skin that had been torn by Isran's silver knuckle guards in a spray of water, blood, and glass. Tiny crystalline shards bit deep into Kaius's jaw and cheek, splattering further blood across the two of them, even as it mixed with the holy water. As Isran expected, Kaius reacted immediately, the talons retracting from metal and leather and letting Isran drop to the floor. Landing as lightly as a khajiit, even in 15 kilograms of armor, he practically danced away from the vampire, watching with some satisfaction as Kaius was left clutching his face, with blood streaming between his fingers. It was not entirely the reaction he was expecting, though. The tiny vials were truly priceless, almost irreplaceable, and had taken over a year to acquire a mere half-dozen of them. Personally retrieving snow from the monastery of High Hrothgar on the throat of the world's peak, he had distilled it, and had the water thrice blessed by priests of Arkay and Stendar, and even an acolyte of the Daedric Prince Meridia. There was nothing else like them within the bounds of Tamriel, and the last time he resorted to using one it had left the vampire screaming in agony as the flesh sloughed off its bones. Kaius, though, seemed annoyed more than anything else, spitting blood and water, wiping away the watery streaks of crimson leaking from the cuts and gashes. The only signs of distress was the frown and the way he pinched a shard of glass out of his cheek. Really? Holy water? Bitter sarcasm slurred around another mouthful of blood as Kaius spat it over the floor. What's next? Psalms and holy artifacts? The same instincts that had alerted him to Kaius's true nature were pleading with him, but Isran bid them no heed. Despite the creature's resistance to the holiest of waters, he was not going to back down, especially as he still had several more tricks up his sleeve. Unfortunately, proving Kaius's prediction to be correct, Isran tore an amulet of Stendar from under his armor and held it out in front of him as his god's blessings filled him with righteous might. Strength coursed its way through his veins, and he knew that his faith was leaving his eyes glowing with holy power. With the purity of both purpose and soul, he could face down the very worst the darkness could offer him and throw it back into the abyss. I am a servant of Stendar and messenger of his justice. Intonating a battle hymn from his days serving as a vigilant, Isran could feel the strength, power, and purity of Stendar's essence flowing into him, as he channeled the god of justice's might into his flesh. I am the instrument of his divine wrath on Nirn. Kaius looked less than impressed, even as the billowing light growing from within Isran's soul burst free of his flesh and began radiating the room in pure light. The aura was enough to crisp the flesh of the damned and repel the mindless husks of the undead, but Kaius simply stood there and rolled his eyes. I am called upon to cleanse his kingdom. Forcing the words from his throat, Isran took a step forward, feeling the might and power of Stendar's blessing upon him as it burned his flesh from within. Bringing ash from the flesh of thine enemies, Kaius continued, finishing the hymn for the vampire hunter. Are you done yet? I am. The smile that creased Isran's face was terrible to behold as Stendar's aura faded away. It might not have had the effect that he'd wanted, but it had served its purpose. But so are you. Hanging from the ceiling, the chain was just one of several suspended from the stones. Some were where he hung his bag filled with sand for unarmed practice. Others was where he hung his lanterns. This one in particular served a specific purpose, and he wrenched down hard on its length. Chapter 3. Dawn's Purpose. Locked into its place in the ceiling, the trapdoor banged open, opening a hole in the ceiling where this afternoon sunlight poured through. The chain rattled as it slithered and jerked, almost like it was alive as the careful series of pulleys and wheels allowed the Dwemer mechanism to unlock and snap into place. Little more than a series of parabolic mirrors used by the lost civilization to illuminate mine shafts, Isran had incorporated it with an alien Varla stone that seemed to store the energies of the sun, even throughout the long nights of winter. Clicking down within seconds of pulling on the chain, the suspended stone burned as the series of mirrors on the fort's roof focused the sun's light onto its surface. Burning as bright and as pure as the sun, it filled the room with the soft, warm light, a light that would, and had, burned vampires into dust and ash in this very room. Other than squinting at the sudden brightness, Kaius seemed totally unaffected, shielding his eyes from the gem the length of his forearm suspended in the center of the ceiling. There was a look of respect on his face, which was in stark contrast to the complete and utter shock that was on Isran's. Isran was rooted to the spot, mouth agape, as Kaius simply crossed his arms with all the look of an irritated teacher showing displeasure to a disobedient pupil. Nothing he had ever seen or experienced in his entire life could have prepared Isran for the sight of a vampire existing in the light of the sun. In this very room, and using this same mechanism, he had successfully lured and slew a 500-year-old vampire ancient of the Garthili bloodline. It should have been impossible. It had to be impossible. It was Hargrondrem. Pulsing through the air and vibrating through the floor, the words struck him with all the force of his blessed warhammer, ripping through his mind and body as he collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. The amulet of Stendar clattered to the floor a split second before he did, his armor doing little to protect him from being winded as he found himself sprawled on his back, looking up at the dangling chains and the open trapdoor to the sky above. He had been defeated, cast down and totally helpless by one of the very creatures he had sworn to destroy. In his heart he knew it would have been at the unholy claws of a vampire that would be his death, but he never would have believed it would be like this, bested by an impossibility, a creature somehow immune, or at least resistant to all of its accursed kind's weaknesses. Well, the voice was slightly slurred, Kaius's face growing puffy, and missing a couple of teeth from the fight left his mouth filling of blood that he spat onto the floor. Now that I have your attention, you won't get anything out of me, monster. You've won. Finish it. By the 9, you are stubborn. Sighing loudly, he dropped down onto a chair that he had dragged over, straddling it and leaning on the backrest of both arms. I didn't go all the damned trouble traveling here just to pick a fight. I told you that I just wanted to pass along some information and retrieve something. You're the one who started throwing your weight around while I was trying to be civil. There is nothing civil about a creature like yourself. You'd be surprised. Fumbling with a pouch at his side, Kaius retrieved a small cloth bandage and pressed it into the side of his face where Isran's silver knuckle guards and the vial of holy water had lacerated it. I don't blame you, though. In my time, I have met a very few vampires who aren't nothing more than animals. The ones in Morthal, for example, were a different breed to the usual, and if they were working with others of their kind, let alone working as the lesser partners in an alliance, then there is something damned dangerous going on in Skyrim. So you kill your own kind? Is that supposed to make me like you? Rabid dogs and trapped skeevers eat their own, and they are animals, just like you. If I was just an animal, then I think that you would have found it very difficult to insult me through a hole in your throat and your heart stuffed in your mouth. There was no hostility or threat in Kaius's words as he continued to probe and feel the wounds on his face, occasionally casting small bursts of restoration magicka to speed along the healing. Despite what you think, I have certainly no love of vampires, and I know that I'm not the only vampire with the opinion that the world would be better off without the curse. I also guarantee that I have killed far more than you and your little band have as well. How noble of you. Thank you. The sarcasm between the two men was thick enough to need a knife to cut through, and Ezran's gaze was powerful enough that Kaius was close to bursting into flames. Which brings me back to the other reason why I'm here. I had heard that the Dawn Guard had been reformed on my way here, which, I'll tell you, was a surprise. I wasn't expecting to have to ask permission to poke around to retrieve what I left here. There is nothing here of interest. Still unable to do anything more than speak, Ezran was doing everything he could to will his body to move once more. The fort has been abandoned in one form or another for centuries, and has been scavenged and pilfered every single year the whole time. That it has. But if you know where to look... Caius trailed off, looking around the room and gesturing to Ezran's collection of books and the Vala stone hanging from the ceiling, still blazing with the sun's light. All of this, and your fancy moves before, tells me that you are more than just the usual run-of-the-mill vampire hunter. I'm sorry you had to waste some of your fancy toys too, but unfortunately for you, I believe in the 9 divines. I don't worship Moloch Baal, and I've got a bit of a unique condition with sunlight. If you have a point, just get to it. How much do you know of the history of the Dawn Guard and this fort? Fort Dawn Guard? The paralysis was still encompassing his body, but the tiniest hints of feeling were coming back to his fingertips. Not that it would be any of use. The creature sitting over him was immune to everything he had at his disposal. Originally owned by the Jarl of Riften back in the Second Era, it was a bit of a black mark on the Hold's history. It was a perfect opportunity for re-establishing the old order, and has all the space we'd ever need. I'm merely trying to put it to good use. You can keep talking if you want. The expression of smugness was almost more aggravating than being at the whims of one of the damned, which forced Ezran to listen to Kaius. I'm nowhere near being able to master this Thune thing, but I know it'll be a while before that shout wears off. Confusion was warring against his burning hatred for the smug-looking being sitting innocently on the chair. They both knew that there was little point in fighting, but he wasn't going to simply give in to the creature. Well, how about I simply cut to the chase, Caius continued. Way back in the Second Era, Fort Dawnguard had been little more than a border post maintained by the Jarl of Riften. Then one day, his son was infected with vampirism, so he turned the fort into his prison, while his daughter went searching for a cure. She never found one, but she did, however, find a few very particular swords. What if I said I knew where to find Maegala's blade? Maegala's blade? You mean the light of dawn? Surprise and shock burst through his stoic demeanour, and despite his predicament, Ezran couldn't help but laugh. It's a legend, nothing more. It hasn't been seen in nearly 200 years. Since the champion of Cyrodiil wielded it. Of all the emotions Ezran expected, the expression of sorrowful melancholy that consumed Caius's features was unusual. I know all too much about those particular stories. Funnily enough, it is related to how I know the light of dawn is here, right now, beneath our very feet. How? Because I'm the one who hid it here, about 70 years ago, in fact. The Vampirum Order in Cyrodiil was getting really unhappy with Maegala's blade hanging around, and it was getting a bit too much of a hindrance keeping it. So I hid it here to throw off their scent. A vampire wielding Maegala's blade. Sounds impossible. Impossible is a vampire that can survive sunlight, and yet here we are. Wiggling back and forth as he leaned his chest into the backrest, Kaius made a show of moving his head in and out of the beam of sunlight flowing through the open trapdoor. What do you really want, then? For several long, drawn-out seconds, Kaius looked about the room once more, staring at the collection of items and the contraption still glowing in the ceiling. Skyrim, and even Tamriel, is under attack by multiple threats. Every new one that appears is just compounding the situation, and from what I have seen, the most serious issue at the moment is the vampires. They are even more destabilizing than any potential dragons that might be roaming around. especially how the Stormcloaks and the Imperials are determined to murder each other at the moment. And why does a creature like you even care about all of this? Because I happen to be part of this world, and I like some of the things that are in it. Skyrim is important, and what happens in this province has far-reaching effects beyond anything you can imagine. I'm just trying to help. You can help by cutting your own throat. Just because you couldn't kill me doesn't mean I'm going to finish the job for you. The sigh this time was deeper, showing more of Kaius' annoyance at Isran's obstinate tone. Look, I'm busy enough as it is without trying to fight the Nine only knows how many vampires are being stirred up. The only reason I'm here is because I came to get the light of dawn to help deal with all the things I need to kill lately. You ever try to kill a dragon with a broadsword before? It's more luck than skill. Isran continued to lay silently, glaring at Kaius while feeling his fingers lose some of their paralysis. I need your help, Isran, and I think you might need mine too. While they weren't effective against me, there are a lot of vampires out there that would find your gadgets and tools here very disagreeable. So I will make you a deal. What kind of deal? I give you the light of dawn, and you continue building up your merry band of hunters here to the point where you can start taking the fight to the bloodsuckers. In return, I have one less thing to worry about, while I try to track down who in oblivion stole the Windcaller's horn from under my nose. I'll even throw in a sweetener for you. I heard from some of the others when I arrived that there is some vampire activity in northern Whiterun Hold. I'll go and investigate it for you. Unable to do much else besides think and talk, Isran stared at Kaius. His feeling continued to return through his body. For anyone else, the offer would have been highly attractive, but the vampire's charms weren't going to work on him. He was, however, faced with a serious problem. Here was a vampire who was resistant to his usual techniques, and while appearing to be willing to support him, Isran knew that there would be ulterior motives behind Kaius's offer. There always was. Deceit and treachery were part of what they were, and they couldn't escape it any more than their thirst for blood. There was no doubt in his mind that it was more likely that Kaius was seeking to use Isran and the nascent Dawn Guard in eliminating some rivals, but that suited him fine, at least for the moment. He needed time and planning to come up with a way to deal with Kaius, and so the decision was easy enough to make. The enemy of his enemy would be the next to die. When the sun rose over Dayspring Canyon as it had in the centuries past, it slowly illuminated the enormous stone edifice carved into the bones of the mountains themselves. Proud, yet weather-beaten and worn from age, the fortress was truly impressive even for something that was little more than a ruin. Those few who were currently calling the ancient fortress home were going about their daily duties, preparing for a day of training, refurbishment, or gathering of supplies, but for the handful standing atop the keep's rooftop they had been watching. Even for someone accustomed to sleeping an hour or less a day, Isran had suffered through a truly sleepless night. It had taken years of practice, study, and a combination of restoration magica, meditation, and sheer willpower, but he had almost cured himself of the need of sleep entirely. After all, it was hard to catch someone sleeping when they were constantly aware at all times. With a vampire in the fortress, though, such a skill didn't matter, as there was no resting for him, whether it was sleep or otherwise. It had taken some time for the strange, shout-induced paralysis to fade from his body, but true to his word, Kaius had led him into the fortress's depths. In the years since he had taken up residence in Fort Dawnguard, Isran believed he had been exceptionally thorough in his searching and exploration, but deep within the natural tunnels that the fort had been built into was a portion that he never knew existed. Unless you knew it was there, and exactly where to look, the passage that Kaius uncovered was truly impossible to find, especially how the rock falls over the decades had almost become part of the tunnel walls. With his vampiric strength, it took a fraction of the time that a team of labourers would have, but Kaius had quickly removed hundreds of kilograms of fallen stone, shifting aside a boulder that would have taken 10 full-grown men to lift, and uncovering a long, plain-looking box with a Dwemer combination lock. There was nothing truly special to the box. and where it had been hidden would have been impossible to find unless purely by accident, but within laid something Ezran had never truly seen before. A dark emerald green, almost black as the night, 1.5 meters in length, and with twinkling, gleaming lights dancing like winter starlight in the perfect blade. Ezran believed he had seen every type and make of weapon throughout Tamriel, but this was a truly unique sword, unlike anything he had ever heard of. While he doubted it was the vampire-slaying weapon of legend forged by the ancient, long-lost Aliads, it was truly impressive. Don't lose it. The way that Kaius retrieved the sword from the box interior was with reverence, and he had been looking upon it almost like it was a long-lost friend. It has slain more than just vampires in its time, and it's also a lot sharper than anything you could imagine. With obvious reluctance, Kaius had handed the weapon over to Ezran, a look of longing and memory on his face, even as he tensed in anticipation of Ezran using the blade against him. For now, at least, Ezran wasn't going to give Kaius the pleasure of correctly deducing his true desires, and he certainly wasn't going to try anything with a blade given to him by such a creature. He didn't even hold it by the hilt, in case there was some insidious enchantment imbued within it, and wouldn't even unsheath it until he had been satisfied it wasn't some elaborate ruse. It had almost been morning by the time they returned from the fort's depths, and now, as the dawning sun rose and illuminated the canyon, Ezran was watching as Kaius and his companions walked along the road to the west. Every step they took was a small measure of comfort to Ezran as he watched, almost unblinkingly, at Kaius's departure. It's a pity they couldn't have stayed for longer, Ezran. By his side, one of the more senior members of the Dawn Guard was watching the trio leave, but with a different focus for his attention. Even though they were dozens of meters away and standing on top the fortress's ramparts, Salan was obviously staring at the curves of the young woman by Kaius's side. They were brightening up the place. That's because you were thinking with your cock, Ro, instead of your brain. The growl ripped from Ezran's throat, but unlike his old comrade, he was feeling a bit more relieved with every step that Kaius took away from the fort with his two companions. While Salan was correct, and the two women that had followed Kaius to Fort Dawnguard were attractive, a thrall was a thrall. Every moment they and their master remained with the Dawnguard, the greater the threat became. Despite his usual inclinations, he hadn't told any of the other members of the Dawn Guard about Kaius's true nature. For now, it would be a secret, especially how none of them else had been able to discern it for themselves. The blind, idiotic fools. Not that telling them was born out of some misguided sense of decency or to keep Kaius's secret. No, it was much more pragmatic. Ezran knew all too well the capabilities of those hunters under his command, and if all of his skills, efforts, and equipment had come up short, then the 24 rank amateurs he had at the moment had no chance at all. A hunter's patience was needed here, not choler and anger. Emotional responses against vampires got your throat bitten out, and he needed time to solve this particular problem. A daywalker. There are always legends of such vampires, possibly for as long as such creatures had been birthed into existence by their Daedric master, but even he had never believed such a thing was possible. Kaius was a threat beyond a threat, but he was potentially useful asset until Ezran could discover a means or plan a stratagem of dealing with him. A reckoning was in their mutual futures, and he would be even more prepared than he had ever been. He would be ready and waiting, if or when Kaius returned from Dim Hollow Crypt.